Hi there, my name is Scot Phillips. I'm the president and founder of StarFish Medical. What I'd like to talk today is a very interesting topic of how to avoid warning letters. Over the years, I've been researching the warning letters every year for the medical device industry and watching the trends and speaking on it around North America. And this year really interested me was to look at how is it that companies go from a 483, or their findings from their FDA audit, how does that convert over to a warning letter? And particularly, there's a finding of not adequate. So the FDA does their audit, they find whatever they find, the company responds, and then there's the FDA in the warning letter says, we've reviewed your response and it's not adequate. And what I found is there's about 3 or 4 really simple, straightforward things that companies are not doing that would avoid a whole pile of trouble for them. So let's get into it. But let me tell you a bit about warning letters to start with. So the number of warning letters for medical device companies has been trending down, interestingly, over the last 3 years. It might have something to do with politics. I don't believe this is an indication that there's less cause for warning letters or for audits. But so we may see this go up or down depending on resourcing in the department and so on. But in 2015, there was 144 warning letters relating to medical device companies. 2016, there was 61, and 27 so far. To a little earlier than mid-year, there's been 10 warning letters. So it's a slow year for warning letters for medical device companies. One of the warning letters from this year was an orthopedic company out of the UK, and their original audit had 6 findings, and they responded to all 6 of them, and in all 6 cases, the FDA responded that their response was inadequate, and thus they got the warning letter. So they got actually 6 reasons for getting a warning letter, and so I'd like to walk you through what those 6 reasons are, because they're kind of illustrative of many of the trends that you'll see. So how I did this work originally is that there was 160 findings of not adequate amongst all of the warning letters that I reviewed from last year, which was, I think, 53 from it. And I only looked at the ones from companies that were more mature. Ones where the finding wasn't that you don't have a quality system, because the FDA does get involved in those type of audits as well. And then I took all of the 160 that were left after that and categorized them as to what it was. What was the inadequacy? Not is this a CAPA finding or whatever, but what is it specifically that they said was not adequate about the response. So here's the number one finding from this particular company's audit, that the field failures were not evaluated for CAPA. Right. So they had all these field failures, that customer complaint file. But they weren't actually looking those for corrective and preventive actions to improve the product or the manufacturing. So the company changed its standard operating procedure for how to make sure that field failures would be evaluated for CAPA, and sent it into the FDA, and the FDA said, great, that's good, however, it's not adequate because you didn't actually prove that you trained anybody on that. So it's that second step. And you didn't actually show any evidence that you used that new SOP to identify causes of nonconformance. So it's nice that you defined it, but you didn't use it and you didn't train anybody on it. And so it's that second step. It's not enough just to say, yeah, I've nominally corrected the thing that you found. The second finding was that their process validation was inadequate. So they had these are orthopedic components. Some of their manufacturing processes cannot be adequately inspected. You have to actually validate that the process itself is going to work reliably. So the audit revealed that 2 of their processes have not been validated adequately, and so the company created a new SOP and redid the validation for those 2 processes. So is that enough? The finding was no. And for the first reason was that they didn't actually fully address the findings. So they didn't do for both of them, and they didn't do it deep enough. That there was no data analysis, so they didn't actually dig into their justification for the validation. because validation is inherently a statistical exercise, right? You're testing a certain number and then you're inferring what's going to happen in the future. And then there was no justification for the frequency of checks to be done, so which is an aspect of statistical. But then the kicker and the interesting part is that they said, well, what we found is actually just a representation of what we believe is probably other things in your company that are similar. And you didn't give us any, there's no systemic review of other manufacturing processes to see if this issue cropped up in those places or not. So there's, again, that second step. This is just an example, prove that you don't have this problem elsewhere. The third finding was non-conforming product controls. So in this case, you have out-of-spec parts showing up, being inspected, and being accepted, even though they're out of spec. And so the company said, oh my gosh, well, we'll review that. And that was their response to the FDA, that they would review that and solve that problem. And so, of course, the FDA didn't really have an alternative other than to say, well, you didn't show any evidence that your method actually worked. But in addition, you didn't do any historical review of other nonconformances to see if this problem actually was elsewhere. So systemic is one thing, historical is the other. So are you looking at other similar processes? Are you looking in history to see if this has been a problem in the past? Particularly, is there anything bad that's been shipped as a result of similar failures? The fourth finding, so in this case, these are implants, knees and hips. Design inputs not established for all sizes. So this is actually an interesting one because it says there are no specs for range of motion or pull-out strength. So what happened is that the company actually was doing on-the-floor tests for range of motion and pull-out strength. So that sounds like a good thing. However, they didn't have any specifications in their product specs for what those things should be. So they got caught for testing things that weren't in the spec, which is kind of counterintuitive. I'm sure that happened over time, that they realized that they had some sort of an issue and they needed to resolve it by doing additional testing, but they didn't actually go back and change the spec to create specifications for those things. So the company gave a summary of how it had fixed these things. And the finding was that there was not a demonstration that all inputs are adequately established. So what kind of evidence do you need to show that your specifications are actually founded on the right things? So it's just kind of an interesting thing. And then they did no historical view of possible release of non-conforming product as a result of this lack of specification. So these are actually things that if you knew that was required as part of your response, you would do that, and then you wouldn't have this finding. So that's kind of what I think is interesting here, is what can you as a company do so that you avoid the warning letter. You do address the sort of standard most common things. So I'm going to show you a Pareto chart coming up in a minute as to out of the 160, what are the things, and particularly what are the ones that can be addressed just by paying attention to the details. Number 5 was the device master record was missing a measurement for a tibial product. So once again, a device master record is basically all the documents you need in order to make the product. The company described, they made their device master record update and they sent a description of that, and the finding was not adequate because it was only a summary result. It didn't actually give a very specific detail. There was not enough detail in there to satisfy them. There was no systemic review of other device master records to see if this problem was a problem for other products that they had, and there was no historical review. So there's those two things again. It's really the second steps, right? And the sixth one, and this is a very common area where the FDA, if you look at the warning letter literature, is the MDR, medical device reporting. So in this case, the medical device reporting SOP consisted of a form from the FDA, which is the 3500A form, and a link to fda.gov. So that's, and there are very specific things, and they're outlined in the regulations exactly what needs to be in a medical device reporting. You need to have a way to decide if an event merits being reported, and then you need to have a frequency, and there's a few things. So I don't have them at the tip of my tongue. So anyway, the company updated their SOP, and they basically didn't follow the requirements. So the finding was deficiencies both on the determination of whether something was reportable and also on the reporting frequency. So the outcome for this company was a warning letter and also refusal of admission, which is pretty common for imported products, meaning that the FDA says you're not allowed to bring this into the US again until you can address these findings. So a pretty serious outcome for a company like that. But I bring up those examples because they kind of cover the gamut. There's a few others. And so this slide is a summary of all of the warning letters from 2016. There's 53 of them. And then 32 were mature, what I considered mature. There's actually a few more than 53, but out of those, I picked 32 as mature QMSs, where the findings of the other ones were you don't have design control, or there's no CAPA system, or there's no manufacturing controls. But those are interesting in their own right, but for a more professional audience, you really, and the kind of people that we're talking to today, people understand how to do regulatory compliance, but they cut corners, or they make judgments that they misinterpret the regulations, whatever. There's reasons why you get a warning letter. So I'm going to, so here's a slide that shows the top 11 reasons out of those 160 assessments where they were the not adequate response. What was the finding? So the number one was that there was no evidence supplied that you had actually completed the corrective action. So that was in over 60% of the cases that was cited. So now that maybe you actually hadn't completed the action yet. But that's a very common. And maybe you only have a short period of time to respond. So it's you can't always address everything. So that one I didn't highlight as a killer, because maybe you just haven't had a chance to deal with it yet, and you're going to get a warning letter because they caught you doing something that's going to take a while to fix. However, the number two one, which is over 50% of the findings, was no retrospective or systemic review. I didn't split them apart, but that one is actually a pretty easy one to. Maybe it's not easy to do, but I believe companies just didn't realize they needed to do that. That the warning letter or the finding is not just a finding of that one thing, and you correct the one thing and you're good. It's actually it's a representative of other things that might be similar. There was a lot of them where the finding was in about a third of the cases where the 483 turned into a warning letter that the document was not included. They didn't actually submit the revised document, and the FDA said, well, it's nice that you made this change, but you didn't send us the document. What a dumb reason to get a warning letter. So that's very easy to not have that oversight. And then the next one was no training records, so that you didn't actually show that your revision actually was implemented. And there's others, and you can look at the slide. But really, if you can cover those three things, retrospective or systemic review, send in the document that you revised, and show that you've done the training on it and that you're actually using the document, then you'll avoid the most common reasons why people get warning letters from their 483s. Thank you very much.